Hi, Jose here, and this is the second video of the series about mobile development architecture. In the previous video, we start talking about native apps, and we talk about Android and iOS apps using the native approach. If you didn't see this video, I highly recommend you to do so, because that's the starting point of the whole discussion about mobile development tiers. And then what you're gonna do in this video now is simply show how to code using Xcode and Android Studio. Before we start our demos, I'd like to start comparing those different architectures. So that's the first one and the only one I'm gonna talk in this video, which is that native architecture. So you can see in this native architecture, you have your app, your native code, get in touch with the platform, leveraging the whole list of widgets that you can use to compose your app, as well as APIs that you can use for example, location, audio, camera, Bluetooth, sensors, and so on and so forth. So let's start now with our first demo. In order to start the Xcode, you have to have it installed before, of course, but that's not the point for this video. It is just a simple presentation. So just type Xcode, and then this is the very first screen. In the left side, you're gonna see some buttons to start new playground or Xcode new project. In the right side, you have a list of previously created projects. I'm not gonna use any of those. Just click here to create a new Xcode project. Once I click in this new Xcode project, I'm gonna be shown the list of different templates I can use for my project. I'm gonna use the most basic one, which is simply single view app. So let's go ahead and click in this single view app and then hit next. In the next screen, it's time to define the product name, the name of our project. This one will be just a simple demo. And you have to define in order to deploy your code to App Store. But at this stage, you don't have to do it. You can leave this theme blank, but this is to define your theme, and you have to provide certificates in order to have this theme available here. I'm not gonna discuss this topic at this moment, of course, because it's a little bit more complex than simply showing them. If you don't have organization name, simply leave your name here. And as identifier is a common practice, and it's recommended that you use simply a reverse order, a simple domain that you own. So if you don't own any domain, just type anything that might be considered unique for your project. After that, you have to define your language. And then you can see you have predefined Swift, and you can also click here and select Objective-C. But for now, I'll leave this as Swift. At the end, you have a list of 3 checkboxes. Then you can check them just to add more content to your initial project assets. I won't click on any of them, simply hit next. And finally, just a matter of define when I'm gonna save our project. I'll click here. This is just showing because I created this simple demo before. So let's click replace. Okay, this is the very first screen. Let me just maximize the screen to get more space. Initially, it's just showing general information about my project. You can see in the left side the list of files already created for my project. In the right side, a context panel that is showing something always related to the content in the middle of the screen. If I go ahead and click on Main Storyboard, Xcode will present to me the main view of the whole storyboard of my project, which means that I can have more than one screen and arrows connecting screens and showing navigations. As this at the moment is just one single view, it's a very simple representation of my storyboard. You can see this arrow here just to say that it is my initial screen. And as you can see, the screen is absolutely blank. If I click on this screen and I click here in the view controller, I can see this checked as my initial view controller. Of course, if you have more than one view controller, just one of them will be marked as initial view controller. And if I click here to unselect this as initial view controller, this arrow will disappear, but there will be no way to start your app. So this is why you can see now in Arlet just saying that you don't have any initial view controller. If I click in this Arlet, I can see my view controller is unreachable. So this controller here, there's no way to go to this controller because you don't have an initial one. So I'll click it back and then define this as initial view controller. So yeah, this is just a simple demonstration. And then still on the right side, you can see a list of components. And if you scroll down, you can see many different components. If you remember that presentation, all of these are available from the platform to our app. I'm gonna use just one, and this will be WK WebKit View. And then drag this WebKit to drop it here. And you can see we have now one element inside our screen. If you click at the bottom, at this button say View as iPhone 8, you can click here and then you can see all the different devices, so you can select different one to see how your project is gonna fit in different devices, as well as different orientation. So you can mark this as portrait and then switch to landscape orientation to see how is your layout in the landscape mode. So as you can see, my element is a little bit off when I switch orientation. That's why we are going to use Xcode to make our element attached to the limits of the screen. So what I'm going to do here is just clicking this 30 button at this area to add new constraints. In this constraint, I'm going to just leave this 40 and 40 for all the edges. Once I define those 4 margins to the top, bottom, left, right, I'm just going to head and click Add 4 constraints. So at the moment, you can see that my element will be anchored to the edge of the screen, just respecting the margin I defined previously. If I switch the orientation, I can see my element taking the whole space except for the margin. The reason for me to choose this WebKit view is just because in one of the next videos, we are going to discuss Cordova, which is a way to implement your cross-platform app, and then you can see what exactly is the element that it uses. So, but you can see for iOS, you don't have just WebKit. You can use many other things like label. You have a label here, you have a text view, you have a text field, you have so many different components. But this web view is a component to run an HTML content in your app. So now I'm going to click in this second button just to show at the same time splitting my screen to show not only my storyboard but also my UI view controller. So let me go ahead and click here just to see the list of assets that I already created for my project. And then click here to make room for this space. So before I make room for this space, if I go back, you can see the list of elements, the tree of elements inside this controller. So we have view, we have a safe area, and we have this web view. And those are the constraints we use to get this view aligned and taking the whole space and respecting the margins. So let's make room again. And then the point is, I'm going to hit Control and click on the element and drag this inside my class in my controller and drop. Once I drop, I have 2 options. I have an option to define the name, and you can see my element is of the type WK-WebView. And now I'm just going to define this name as WebView. Once I hit Connect, you can see I create an IB outlet. IB outlet is just to define a link between the element in my view to a variable in my controller. So now Xcode is complaining because I'm using WebView, which forced me to import this package. So I'm just going to import here, import WebKit. Once I import WebKit, this area is gone, and then I can use it. If I click back to this area, I can simply go here. Instead of showing the main storyboard, I can go straight to the view controller, and then I can see the whole screen just to see my controller. We don't have time to type much code, but I'm just going to use this web view to load an URL. So you can see here there is a load option to make things easier for me. I can just click here to say load, and then I can see there is a request, and I have to pass an object of type URL request. I don't have this object yet. Let's go ahead and create this object. First of all, I'll create the constant using let, and I call this content URL. And this URL will be a URL that I pass here, and inside this URL command, I'll define the URL that I'm gonna show in this web view. I can just type, but for this command URL, I'm passing the string for this URL. Once I have this URL, I can define request. It's just the name of the variables. It doesn't matter the name exactly. I'm just using the name to be more specific what I'm doing, but I can name my variables whatever I want. Now I'll create the URL request that is necessary for this command web view load down here. For this URL request, you can see there are some options. I'm going to use just the first one. This is URL, and then define my URL. Another point specific to Swift, as this URL might not point to anything, I have to tell this URL request that this URL is actually something that I know there will be something valid. So I'm not going to discuss this in details right now, but just to make sure this URL will point to a valid address in the internet, I'm saying to Swift that this URL is correct. So now finally I can just simply type this request. Now I can run this project, but before I go ahead, I will just paste a snippet of code. I won't tell you why for the moment, but just trust me, this is just define some shadows for this component. So I have this web view and define layer and define some shadow color, shadow offset, and something like that, just to define a shadow for this component. I promise you I'm going to explain this in a later video. So yeah, my code is done. In order to run, I can define here in which simulator I'm going to run this code. So as you can see, I have a list of simulators as well as some device that can have this attached. I don't have any device for the moment. I'll just select iPhone X because it's the newest one. So now I can just click on this button to build and then start my application. This will show up my simulator and load my application. Of course, as my URL was just a YouTube URL, this is automatic. It's just playing. So I can close, and then I can see that there is a way to show in a landscape mode. And then you can see my component is actually centralized, respecting 40 pixels for the margins. But yeah, inside the content is not really good, but it's not necessarily because of my component. That's the content of YouTube. So yeah, let's go ahead for the second part of this video, and let's do exactly the same we've done for iOS. Let's do exactly the same for Android. But before we go, I'd like just to highlight where we are at the moment. You can see here in the code that we are inside a view controller, which is a class. And inside this class, we have what we call method. This is a function. This is a snippet of code where you execute something. This function specifically is called viewDidLoad, which is exactly the function that happens when this view shows up. There's one of the functions that we call lifecycle hooks, which means that this view has a life cycle, has events that happens at a particular point of time, and then you can execute some logic once those events occur. The same logic, although it's not the same method name and not exactly the same event, but the same logic of lifecycle hooks will exist as well for Android. So to start a new Android project, we have to basically call Android Studio, and for this time I will run the Android Studio 3.1 preview. That's my Android Studio already installed on my computer. You can see the initial screen is very similar. Instead of having the right side, we have on the left side a list of previously created projects. And in the right side, we have an option to start a new Android Studio project. Let's go ahead and click on this button. The first screen asking for my project, I'll just call Simple Demo as well. And for the company name, that's pretty much the same logic that we used before for a unique name for iOS. But here, instead of having to type a domain name in a reverse order, I can just type in the right order. That Android Studio will be smart to just use my package name as the opposite side. You can see here the domain name is reversed. The reason for this location is Simple Demo 3. That's because I probably create Simple Demo and Simple Demo 2. Let's leave this as Simple Demo 3. So just to don't override any other thing, I'll call this Simple Demo 3. But if you call this Simple Demo 2, instead of asking to replace, Android Studio will consider that you actually are editing your project, not replacing it. So if you leave this as Simple Demo 2, you will end up editing your project, creating new activity, creating new stuff for your project, instead of replacing the whole project. So that's why I'm gonna call it Simple Demo 3. You can see here that there is a checkbox talking about Kotlin. So we are not gonna use Java for this project. So let's leave this checkbox marked in order to create our project using Kotlin. For the next screen, this is very important because that's the point you define what's the minimal version of Android API your app will support. So if you click here in the first select box, you can see a list of old Android versions, but the farther you go for the API support, the greater support you provide, which means that if you keep this API 16, you can see that roughly at least 99.2% of device will be supported by your app. But if you select something newer, like for example, let's go and select Nougat, you can see just 80% of users will at the moment be supported by your project. So you must keep that in mind as well, because if you stick to a new version, you pretty much have more resource. You don't have to worry about old stuff. You don't have to test an old device, but you end up not supporting old device. So that's why. Let me just go back and put this at API 16. The same happens to other types of APIs. We can add to our project Android Wear, Android TV, Android Auto, and also Android Things. I won't click on any of those, of course, just for this simple presentation. I'll click here next. And then for this screen, you have options to start the template for your initial view, or how they are called for Android, the initial activity. Of course, you can select to don't add any activity if you have plans to don't use it, or if you have plans to create later. So it's up to you. But the most common option is this empty activity, which is an activity pretty much the same way that we create the initial view for iOS. So let's click next. For the last screen, I'll define the activity name, which is MainActivity by default, and the layout name. I'll click Finish before I can explain what exactly they are. This might take some time just to create your project and to build everything. As you can see, Android Studio is opening, and then I can see a layout also similar to Xcode. We have a list of project elements on the left side, so we can click here to unfold, and see 3 main directories. If we open this Java directory, as you can see, even if you have a Kotlin project, this directory is still being called Java for retro compatibility. If we open the first subfolder, you can open here and see MainActivity, which is this MainActivity.kt already open on the right side. Also, if you click here to unfold the rest folder, you can also see the layout file, which is activity main. Okay, where's the right side? Where's the right panel? Where's the visual way to interact with our project? If we click here in this activity main, you can see there are 2 options. One is to see design and the second one is to see in the text mode. So the concept of the whole storyboard doesn't exist for Android, but you can, for every single view, every single screen in your project, you can also have a very good visual editor. I'll click on this button just to get more space, and then we can see this first screen side by side, the visual mode as well as the blueprint mode. What's the main difference? Actually, the blueprint mode is a copy of the visual mode, but sometimes when you add elements to your view, those elements also have graphic resource, and then you might want to see those resources, and sometimes you don't want to see those resources, just to see the limits, the edges of every single component. So it's preferable sometimes to see a representation of where the component is being placed instead of seeing the content of the component. But you can choose to show both, or design, or blueprint. The third option is select now, just to show both. Okay, I'm gonna delete this default element. For now, we have nothing included in our project. If we go to the text mode, you can see we have basically the constraint layout, which is also similar to the auto layout for iOS. That's very interesting. At the same time, compare iOS with Android, and then you can see they sometimes are very similar to solve the same problems. Again, I will use a palette to select a web view component. I will use this search bar and then type web view, that's here, and then I will also drag and drop this to my area. I can drop this on my visual editor or my blueprint editor as well. Now this web view is taking the whole screen. As you can see, I'm putting this web view at the center. And then you can now see this arrow, a kind of spring arrow. And then on the right side, instead of showing all the attributes for this component, because you can see pretty much the same idea. On the right side, you have, once you click every single element, this panel in the right side will show attributes for this element. But if you scroll down, there is an option to see view fewer attributes. If we click here, you can see this graphic regarding constraints to the main. Initially, I'll define my web view, the same name as I use for iOS. I'll put here web view. And then I'll also define some margins. Let me type the same 40 pixels for the margin. Not sure if it's too much. And let me add 40 as well here. Also 40 and also 40. Okay, it's also possible to choose what's the device I'd like to preview. You can see Nexus 4, and then if you click, you can show other options to see in different devices. Let's go to the main activity to define where we're going to show in this web view component. Inside the main activity, we also have the main class for this initial view. And then inside this main class, we have another method, which is also a lifecycle hook. In this case, it's called onCreate, which means that once your activity is created, you can run this code. What this code is doing is basically setting this activity main as the content. So in Android, you see explicitly what you're going to show per activity. So it starts from the activity, and the activity say, okay, I'd like to show this template. So that's why we have this XML, and then you can load this XML in your app. After we define the set content view, let's use exactly the web view, the ID we defined previously. So let's say webview.webviewClient, just to define a new web view client. This is an initial step just to define what will be the layout manager for your web view. And then the next command is pretty much the same as the web view for iOS. I have this web view load URL. But instead of creating an object of type URL, I can simply define a string for my URL. Again, I have my YouTube link to paste here. And if you compare, in Swift code, you have the string attribute. For Swift, we call this a named attribute. This is also possible for Kotlin, but here is just the Android Studio showing that to me. So this is just to be clear, what's the attribute I'm feeding with this value. That's pretty much it. We just have for Android to ask users for permission to use the internet. And if you go here to the project, you have the manifests folder, which is good because you can see one example for every single folder here. Let's open this Android manifest. This Android manifest is the main definition file for your project. In here you define what permissions you need to ask user in order to run your app, and many other things like this, for example, just saying that my main application is from the beginning running this main activity. That's why when we start our app, this activity will show up. But before this application, let me add this user's permission. We have a long list of permissions, but the first one is exactly the one that we want. That's internet. Okay, so now we can just close this user permission, and then we are done to run our code. But again, I'll give you as an extra more stuff to our code. So please, for Android, allow me to do this thing and define more attributes. I'll just paste them here. Those attributes, clip children, clip padding, elevation, and outline provide. In a following video, I'm going to discuss those attributes. We could also use the design mode to click on the right side and then select what you want, but as I wouldn't like to explain those features for now, let's just give it a run. To run our project, instead of having a button on the left side, we have the button on the right side. That's pretty much the same. This button is just to build the project, and this button will build and also run our application in one of the predefined emulators or attached device. I'll click to run app. This will try to localize devices attached to my computer and also virtual devices. I just have one virtual device defined now, so let's just click on Pixel API 27, which is at the moment the newest API. Let's hit OK. I know why this is not loading. That's because YouTube is running a JavaScript code, and we have to define permission to run JavaScript code inside our web view. This is specifically for Android. So let's give the permission on MainActivity. Click here. After we load, we can also define WebView.settings JavaScript enabled. Let's define this to true. So now we can run again. Click, select now, hit OK. Seeing the emulator, our application running and automatically starting our video. So yeah, that's pretty much it. As I said at the beginning, it was just a presentation, just a simple demo showing on iOS and Android. The main idea for this presentation is showing you how interesting it is to code using Android Studio and also Xcode. You can see many tools to make your life easier. We have advanced visual tools as well as a very smart and interesting text editor. That's one of the main reasons that I truly believe that it is possible for you to start learning iOS and Android at the same time without necessarily going with an approach above the native tier. So you can, and sometimes it's preferable to use them, but don't be afraid to dive into Android and iOS native development. They are very powerful and also easy to learn. I hope you liked this video. If you are seeing this video on YouTube, I'd like you to please click to like, share this video with your friends, and then why not subscribe to my channel. I don't put much stuff on this channel, but yeah, maybe depending on how it goes, I'll start posting more and more videos on my channel on YouTube. So yeah, see you in the next video.